say the same thing. But I mean, there were people who, when I was doing this, at that period, were of that same Hal Holbrook ethos.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But the financial engineers were clearly on their way to ascendance.
Yeah.
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 Okay. All right. As usual, I don't plan to begin with the movie, which, I mean, it's been a few years since I watched it, but I was blown away too. It's worthy of Zola, one of my favorite authors, and among the many brilliant things about it, again and again, you meet a new character, and in the first 3 lines of dialogue, that character has told you everything you need to know about them. It's quite uncanny that way, but we will get to that. Now, we're in the 1980s, and that decade was dominated politically, of course, by Ronald Reagan. And I'll talk in a minute about that, but meanwhile, you had the generational voting reading, which did something to explain how Ronald Reagan was elected by such huge majorities twice. And any comments, surprises, or anything else on what you learned from that?
I just think it's the fact that the division tends to be so close is part of our big problem. We've never been able to get to any kind of a landslide victory in a while, or any kind of strong mandate.
Oh, okay.
In terms of the partisanship between Republicans and Democrats, it always seems to be close to 50-50, up and down the ladder. With, I guess, the millennials are the exception, but
that has been true. Although Obama did win pretty comfortably, certainly the first time. But in general, yes, that has been true since 2000. Yeah. I mean, Clinton won comfortably, although Clinton never was anywhere near 50% of the vote.
Yeah, he got 43%.
Right. Yeah. But Ross Perot.
That's not comfortable.
Were you surprised to find that the boom generation, after giving the 1976 election, again very narrowly to Jimmy Carter, was solidly for Reagan both times?
Yeah, that was amazing. That was
right. Was anybody else surprised?
I was.
Yeah. Okay. And now.
Shocked.
Okay. Right. Okay.
Okay, true confessions. I voted for Reagan the first time.
I'm not sure.
30-year-old.
Oh, okay. Did you did not vote for him the second time?
Yeah, I guess I did.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of being a small business person,
yes,
it's been great since 1980 to be in business. So can't complain.
Okay. Now
that may bear on the movie too, by the way.
That what?
That may bear on the movie as well.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Okay. Now, we're all, oh yes, I did want to mention, and I noticed this teaching at the War College, and Steve and Eileen may be able to talk to this too. Reagan was very popular with at least the earlier half of Generation X. Yeah, Jocelyn also could speak to this. And particularly because that they had come to consciousness during the 70s when everything seemed to be going wrong, economic distress, price hikes, all sorts of problems, and America held hostage. And I heard this from many of my students at the War College, that when he came in all full of confidence, it really resonated with them. Now, in the 60s and 70s, as we have seen, boomers, particularly on the left, had been declaring war on restraints of various kinds, particularly personal, and silence were joining in on that. The 70s was also the era of the divorce revolution, when the divorce rate skyrocketed, actually among all the adult generations at that time. But Reagan loosened restraints of another kind, to begin with his tax cuts, which I think cut the top rate from about 70 to 50 initially. No, actually, it may have been somewhat lower than that. And secondly, he did away, in effect, with the idea that it was really important to try to balance the budget. And he quickly created a permanent deficit that we have had almost the whole time since, except for the end of the Clinton years. And we will perhaps come back to that at some point. He and his team pushed the idea that these tax cuts were going to pay for themselves because they were going to increase economic growth so much that revenue was going to grow anyway. And revenue did grow, but it didn't grow nearly enough, and the deficit ballooned and became, as I say, more or less a permanent feature.
Well, David,
Yes?
if you're going to mark 1980 as some turning point, I don't think the data really supports that. The real turning point was earlier than that. It was more like 72 or 73 when wages began to stagnate.
That's
And the
true, yes.
So I mean, Reagan was just, he was of the same ilk as his immediate predecessors.
In
in that
some
regard.
respects, yes. The pattern was already in place. Well, I won't get into that. Okay.
Hey, Dave,
Now-
Chaz says that he's trying to get into the meeting.
Oh, sorry, Chaz. I don't see him.
So I just pulled up the tax rate table here, and the highest marginal tax rate was in the 70s from 1965 through 1980, 69% in 1981, lowered to 50% in 1982.
Oh, I was right.
So-
Okay, yeah.
So, and then ultimately at the end of the Reagan administration, through the Tax Reform Act of 1986, lowered to 38.5%. And then
Yeah.
in 1988, at the very end, to 28%.
But
And,
you
So,
can't-
yeah, okay.
You can't take
Ah.
those numbers in isolation because the deductions, what you could deduct, changed radically, particularly at the business level in that same time period. So we had high tax rates, but you could deduct a lot of stuff, like companies could buy, owners could buy cars for them, for their wives, pay for country club memberships. All that went away.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Continuing. Hi, Chaz. The waiting room only just showed up a few minutes ago, a few seconds ago. I don't know why. Okay. And somebody else was there who hasn't popped up. Well, I don't know what thing. Okay. Other things he did. A lot. Okay. In addition to cutting taxes, we started spending much more money on the military. He introduced Star Wars, which has been a big chunk of the military budget actually ever since, even though it has never actually worked out, which was a kind of portent of things to come. At home, okay, here he is. Hello, John. Yes.
Good, good.
Okay, I'm talking about Reagan. The government joined in an offensive against unions, which business was already waging. Reagan very dramatically fired all the air traffic controllers when they went on strike. And that was a signal, and certainly was a big step in the general attitude about unions in those days. And Paul Volcker at the Fed decided he was going to put an end to inflation, which was running at a very high level and had run at a very high level for 20 years. interest rates were jacked up over 10%. I remember they were already very high. I think the first house I bought was in 1978, and that was we were paying 8 or 9% at that point. And that created a very severe recession in Reagan's first couple of years, and actually took a long time to get out of the effects of that. But by 1984, people were getting back to work, although not necessarily the same jobs. Another great movie, possibly to use for this course, although I never did, would be Michael Moore's first Roger and Me, which really turns out to be very prophetic. And it's about the impact of Reaganism, really, in certain industrial communities. But at any rate, the Heartland was certainly sold on this, and not only the Heartland, because he was reelected in 1984 by a huge majority. And by that time, Walter Mondale was probably the last representative of old New Deal style liberalism to run. And he was pretty lucky to be renominated against Gary Hart, who was running against New Deal liberalism as well. So certainly that no longer fit the mood of the country. Now, I want to talk about some other things going on in the 80s, although I don't have any clips from any movies except this one tonight. One interesting point, again, perhaps foreshadowing the split that was going to dominate our politics down the road. There were two kinds of movies about Vietnam in the 80s that were very popular. Can anybody identify what they were? Michael. Oh, you're mute, Mike. Okay.
Yeah. So I think Rambo, epitomizes one, which is the heroic saga, and then I think Oliver Stone, Platoon, and Apocalypse Now, and
not Apocalypse Now. That was not.
But Platoon,
yes,
I think is another is an example. And I don't remember when the Stanley Kubrick movie came out, but there's
Full Metal Jacket.
I think that was
Full Metal Jacket, yeah.
That was in the 80s also, I'm pretty sure.
But we can take Platoon as the example,
Sure.
as the exemplar of the.
Yes. In fact, I looked it up, and the first two Rambo movies grossed a total of a little over 400 million. And Platoon and Born on the 4th of July together grossed about 300 million. So both were extremely popular, both sets of movies, although the Rambo ones were more popular. And again, the kind of conspiracy thinking that is dominating politics today was already around. And I met a lot of people in the 80s who really believed that there were dozens of American prisoners still being held somewhere in Indochina, which turned out to be not the case.
I remember
okay.
those conspiracy theories popping up still into the 90s on popular TV shows like JAG and such.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah. Okay. Now, this was when my career had gotten going in academia, and there were changes going on there too. And I just want to talk to you about one incident, which I discussed in my autobiography. It didn't involve me personally at all, but it turned out to be very revealing. And it had to do with a new generation of historians of American communism, mostly boomers or right on the boomer silent cusp, who had published a number of books in the 80s. And they drew a very long review from a GI historian named Theodore Draper in the New York Review of Books. And Draper had been the leading historian of American communism for some time. He had actually been a communist himself as a young man, I think in the early 30s or so. By the time of the Second World War, he no longer was. And he had written a couple of books about it, emphasizing, quite properly in my view, that no matter why people joined the Communist Party or what positions it took, it had been, first and foremost, all the while, basically a tool of the Soviet Union, which took its orders from Moscow. Now, the interesting thing about these new historians, as he pointed out, was that they claimed to have a different perspective, and they claimed that the reason they had this different perspective was from their own lives, that they had been new left activists in the 60s, and somehow that had given them a new way of looking at American communism, namely as they put it, an expression of authentic American radicalism. And they tried in various ways, and most of their books were quite small scale, like most historians' books beginning around that time, if not sooner. They tried to show instances in which people seemed to be motivated by something else. Draper, however, was able to show, and I had this experience myself too, was new historical works of other kinds, that if you check their footnotes, frequently they didn't really prove what they were trying to prove. In addition, the new people argued, well, even if they were directed by Moscow, that's not what's important to know about them. What's important to know about them is the character of their lives, because these people are people we haven't written about before, and we have to look into them now, which became a very popular historical trope. Now, that wasn't a huge development, but it was a harbinger of something big. Okay, and now we're going to be getting into it, because last but not least, we have these changes in the economy and changes on Wall Street. Now, Wall Street and finance had been very, very different during the high. The crash, way back in 1929, had led to very extensive regulation of the financial community. It created the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission to insure against bank failures. The SEC was created, and the Glass-Steagall Act was passed, one of the first pieces of New Deal legislation that said you couldn't be a commercial bank and an investment bank at the same time. And as a result, it is fair to say, if you were an ambitious young person in the 40s or 50s, and you wanted to make a lot of money, you would not become a banker. And there's a good chance you wouldn't become a broker. You would want to go into a major corporation that made things and work your way up through that corporation. And the emphasis within the corporation was on making it bigger, on making more things, on making different things. Because the bigger the corporation was, the more top managers there would be, and the more big incomes there would be. In addition, with 90% marginal tax rates, which was the top until 1964, your income was essentially capped. So once you had reached a certain level, a level which wouldn't look very high today, you had to distinguish yourself in some other way. And that was undoubtedly very healthy for the economy. So all this was beginning to change big time in the 80s. And there was a lot more money involved. Now again, the symbol of the old Wall Street and the old values in the movie is Lou, the Hal Holbrook character. And as I say, one of the brilliant things about the movie is how quickly you learn what you need to know. I wrote down the first lines of his, the first lines out of his mouth. Too much cheap money sloshing around. It all started with Nixon going off the gold standard. And then he says, good things sometimes take time. And that pretty much summarizes his view of his profession and what's important and what's not. But before we get into these details, and I don't usually do this, I hope you've learned, I think you've gotten to know me well enough now. Lots of times when teachers ask questions in class, it's an invitation to the student to try to guess what they're thinking. And a long time ago in my teaching career, I decided to abandon that practice. And I would try to tell my students that when I asked a question, it was because I thought there were a lot of possible answers, and I already knew what I thought, but I wanted to know what they thought. So I'm really curious as just to exactly how anything about this movie hits you watching it now, 35 years later? No, a little less than that, at this particular moment in history that we are in now.
Well, I'm willing to start. For one thing, I've been working in investment banks for many years, just as a
Oh.
software engineer, not in finance.
Oh,
And let me tell you, the environment there is very boring, very risk obsessed, and just a completely ordinary middle class office job. It is nothing like the exciting potential for making tons of money that you get out of these 80s movies. But I remember that energy in that time period, and that idea that if you went into finance, that was how you were going to get rich. Now it's just another job.
don't you think, though, that you would find that atmosphere in a hedge fund or in certain departments of one of the big banks?
I'm not sure, but I
Okay.
think that what the hedge funds are trying to do now is, again, they're trying to, what you hear people saying is, where do you find the growth? It's so hard. Nobody can
Yes.
find the growth anymore.
Right.
You need to find
Right.
that to make the big money. And where is it? It seems like it's gone now.
Yeah.
And another thing that's what struck me about the movie was how they were portraying all these sort of elements of what status symbols were in the 80s. Like they were eating sushi and Haagen-Dazs and
They had sushi
And-
making
yeah.
equipment in their kitchens.
But
I found intriguing.
that just seems kind of ordinary now. Everybody eats sushi now. You go and get it at the grocery
Right.
store.
Did you
Everybody
get
has
a
Haagen-Dazs.
Did you get a kick out of Gordon's telephone on
Oh,
the beach?
of course, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, Susan.
I you know, as you know, David, I worked in that in environment, not in investment banking, but I was pretty close to it. Anyway, I think one of the things that has happened now with the generations that we're seeing in the investment banking world, I think the greed factor has died down quite a bit. I think we have young people who are more interested in, they want to make money, but they also want a life. And I actually know at least one person who was in investment banking for Deutsche Bank, and a woman, and she finally left the field because she was just tired of sleeping in the office, and has remained in the investment business, but in a completely different capacity. So I think that what we're seeing in the film is definitely an era where it was go, and greed, was definitely motivating people. Not to say that it doesn't still, but not in quite the same way. And I think also I don't really know for sure about this, but I think there may be a stricter regulatory environment as well. But at any rate, I think that, as I say, what I perceive now to be happening, and has a lot to do with a change in values, or change in what young people want for themselves. They've seen their parents, live and work, 24 hours, and they don't want that for themselves. They want to, have kids. They want to have time for family.
Okay.
And I
You
don't think-
celebrated workaholism.
Yeah, I don't think it's just in the investment world. It's in the law firms. I mean, it's in it's in the professional world in general.
When I was interviewed, actually, I was asked for my position I currently have as in the Boy Scouts of America, I was asked about, well, are you going to be a workaholic? Essentially, was the direction of the questions, which kind of struck me as odd. It seems like now employers are now looking for people who aren't going to be who will have a good life-work balance, and that's a overall general look of what they're looking for. Because people who don't have that, from what I've spoken to with my bosses since, is they burn out quickly, and they don't want people who burn out quickly anymore.
Very interesting.
But Chaz, you're working for a nonprofit, right?
That's very true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that
That is
my
different.
experience, you know, my experience is that nonprofits are run very differently
Oh.
than profit-making organizations. I
Completely.
guess what I would say is, to me, the history of the last 50 years is that stability breeds instability, and we developed this 50s and 60s time where everything was motoring along and seemed stable. So all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but over time, the idea of levering up, leveraging balance sheets became a way to make money. But it was only because of the history of stability. And
Yep.
it ended up creating a lot of instability.
Yeah.
Yes.
But if you look at somebody like Michael Milken, who, of course, eventually went to jail, I think, or was fined a lot of money.
He did go
it-
to jail. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it all had to do with taking balance sheets that had not been deployed properly, at least in the 80s terminology, and arguing against those balance sheets to reward the shareholders and reward the investment bankers. And I do think we're in a very different world now, because since 2008 and now because of COVID, we're in a period of instability. So those strong balance sheets, rather than being a target for raiders, are now something you want to own. So it's a big difference. Times have moved on.
Okay. Janie.
Okay. When Bill was writing, well, he did Millennials Rising was in 2000. And then when they were following the millennial generation as they were entering the workplace, there was a lot of talk about work-life balance. And if you want to hire the best, brightest millennials, you're going to have to figure out the work-life balance piece. And as to how far that is right now, I'm not real sure. But I also, as an educator, probably 10, 15 years ago, we would see a lot of kids who were very tech smart, very bright mathematically, and all wanted to be quants in hedge funds. And some of them made a lot of money. And then the other half of that group wanted to, work in Silicon Valley or do gaming. And now the people that I know that are there in Silicon Valley, who are in their 30s and 40s, they are yearning for the work-life balance. And some of them are moving away. Some of them are really tired of the pressure to continue on. So I think it'll be interesting to see how the work-life balance piece actually ages with the millennial generation, and then what happens with the generation underneath them. So the other interesting thing is that the whole issue of generations in the workplace, that is where all of this stuff has become a huge industry for marketing purposes, for predicting, what's going to be hot, what's not, what can you sell, what can you not sell. And the people in development, property development, commercial development, they are really banking heavily on the millennials and the next generation wanting work-life balance, wanting communities that are walkable, offer all these amenities. Who knows if that's going to hold, but billions of dollars have been spent in those kinds of developments. So one gets, I think, you have to be a little circumspect in how far out. If one generation seems to work in one way in an economic or in a job situation, then assume that as it's going to be a straight line history, in which is exactly looking at how generations change over time. Investing in one way of working, or assuming that money is going to be made or not made, and then assume that's always going to be that way, because I think that's partly what we're looking at.
Yeah, because can millennials afford that nice little house that's near all those amenities that you can walk to?
Right, I know.
Probably not.
Yeah, I live right in the edge
Yeah.
of Tyson's Corners, which is projected to go from 17,000 to 100,000 people. And these gorgeous, huge tall glass buildings. And they're assuming that all of the, high-tech millennials are going to buy these very, very expensive, small, high-end apartments. And I'm thinking,
Yeah.
no. But why are they investing in it? I mean, at least the developers are. So we'll see.
All right. Let's see if we can try to go back to reactions to the movie.
Wait a minute, David, are you going to answer the question?
Which question?
Ah!
Which question? Judy, yes. You're mute, Judy. You're mute.
I didn't quite buy his turnaround. Seemed kind of hokey and I don't know.
Oh, Charlie Sheen's turnaround, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, one day he's all up in Mr. Gecko's team, and then the next day he's on Team Dad. It was rough. It was just a little hokey to me. Plus that, I cannot stand Daryl Hannah. I agree with Jacqueline Kennedy. She looks like she needs a bath.
I didn't want to be the one to bring it up, but I did think that was the one very unfortunate piece of casting. And in fact, I believe it is true that Stone wanted Sean Young, who played Mrs. Gecko, to be in that part, but somebody else insisted. So it turned out to be Daryl Hannah.
Honestly, with regards to the turnaround, I bought it, but mostly because it was like, it triggered his, Gecko triggered his sense of honor, is what I took it. It's like, hey, you gave me your word that this was going to be good. You broke your word. Well, then, F you. But that's just me. So I kind of bought it.
Also, his dad had a heart attack. That might have been part of it.
Yes,
too.
that's
Yeah.
right. That's right. Yes.
Then he has to worry about his mom, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yes, Janie.
Yeah, I was going to say, in writing the script, making the whole story work out, I understand how the turnaround at the end, how that was written in. And, as a viewer, you go, yay, yay, good wins out in the end. But in real life, people don't really joyfully go off to prison. It's a pretty nasty place. And so, insider trading and all the rest of it, you look at the Martha Stewarts of the world who picked herself up and went on again. But yeah. I don't think many people turn themselves in. I think unless.
Oh, he didn't turn himself in. He didn't turn himself
exactly,
in.
That's what I was going to say. He was caught, and that's exactly right.
Right.
And so, I agree that the turnaround is pretty quick at the end, but you got to write the script and you got to make the story work. So I understand that part. But anyway,
it was very Hollywood. I mean, everything was exaggerated.
Well, Gecko is based on mainly Ivan Boesky with a dash of Michael Milken, I would say. And both of them did do time.
Yeah.
About a couple of years worth each. Milliken, actually, he was not pardoned by Trump, although he got clemency. But that which I don't understand what that means, since he had served a sentence long ago. But it wasn't a full pardon, but he did manage to make that happen. And Boesky has never gone back into that kind of thing. Yes, Tamara.
Well, I'm still back, and you all, many of you apparently are in this business, and I'm certainly not. But I was very surprised when you all said, oh, this was a lot more exaggerated then, and now there's more regulations and it's different. And because I watched that and I thought, this is just prescient. It's like this times 100 now. So I don't know exactly what I've been fed, but I certainly had a very different impression than those of you who've been in the business. So
What do you mean by times 100? What are you thinking of?
More income inequality, more power of the corporations and the finance, more them walking away at the stock market doing well right now in the middle of what's going on financially, and less regulations. As far as I know, nobody went to jail in 2009 for that debacle. It just seems to me like things have gotten like it was then and worse now.
Well, I think, I had the same feeling, but I think I'm learning something very interesting. It does seem to me that this is, as it turned out, a preview of 2009. And then going up until 2009, everything was this to the nth degree in many ways. But I think I'm learning something new tonight, which is that 2009, after all, was 11 years ago. And perhaps there have been significant changes since then, even in a good direction. Although I do have to disagree with Susan about one thing, when she said about more regulation. That may be true in some areas, but it is my understanding that based on certain court decisions, it is now almost impossible to get convicted of insider trading. I
didn't say, I just said possibly. There may be that there, I'm not thinking about insider trading, but I find that very interesting what you've just said.
Yeah.
I'm thinking more of I'm really thinking of the kind of the investment banking world, not so much the brokerage world. I honestly, I said I don't know. I really don't know. So.
Well, what about things like the?
But this isn't about.
Let's hear from Michael, who also has some firsthand.
So I either am or was a securities lawyer.
Yeah.
And so I can say that it is certainly possible to be convicted of insider trading today. It is not harder to be convicted of insider trading. What has changed is that there is a culture among the major investment banks and even the less major investment banks that stresses compliance much more. So that is significantly harder to convict any of the institutions. And so you really end up, I think, if people are cheating, they're basically cheating in the way that you would have seen, for example, to pick another movie, The Wolf of Wall Street, which is basically a very marginal, it was a very marginal institution, not central to any of the economic changes that we're focusing on. The one thing I do want to say about what Tamara says is that, again, the change in marginal tax rates and the change in the way taxes have occurred are such that wealth has become significantly more concentrated.
Yeah.
And in a large measure, this is a reaction to something that you saw in the movie, which is the Teldar scene when, if I can bring it back to the movie, when Gecko says, look at the people on the dais, they own less than 1% of the company. And today, that is absolutely not the case. Today, the management of a company owns either directly or indirectly through options a much higher percentage of companies. And because of the way capital gains are taxed and because of the way these things work, And because of the way the stock market has appreciated, that's a reason why their wealth has increased so significantly. And so, I think I think in terms of presaging what's happened, I think that's seen at the stockholders meeting, together with the change in marginal tax rates and the system of taxation in the country, go a long way to explaining some of what's happened.
Can I just jump in? And Michael, you hit it. You got what I was trying to get at, which is the compliance issue that I think that when I said regulatory, there's just a great deal more of the application of internal compliance within these institutions, because they've been through so much, that they have been literally forced to, cross every T and dot every I. And I know in a very sort of simple way, just from having been in the banking world, and then also having to deal with it in certain ways, that the regulatory environment within the institution is just much more stringent. But this film isn't about social inequality. This film is about the crazy world of Wall Street, and at that time, so I just accept the fact that these people are all there trying to get rich, and you do see hardly, if any, people of color, maybe one or two, and not many women either.
That's true.
I mean, women were beginning to come into that industry around the time that I got into it. That's where you see some of the social inequities, just in the representation. But it's not about that these people have more money than people, in people of color, or people in different social classes.
I can't agree with that, Susan, because the whole episode of the airline and what is likely to happen to the airline and all the good working class jobs that are going to be wiped out.
Yeah,
that's a big part of the movie.
It becomes a big part because he, in his turnaround, he basically one-ups Gecko. I mean, he uses his exact strategies to screw him.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a big part of the film. It's certainly an important part of the film.
Okay.
That's how I perceive it.
All right. Well, I am going to. I tend to agree with Tamara about some very important points, and in fact, I'm going to go now to the thing that I had at the very end of the outline, but it seems like it ought to come up now. It ends with Charlie Sheen on his way to jail. There is certainly an implication in that final scene where he's with the prosecutors that Gecko stands a good chance of going to jail pretty soon too. And in fact, as I've said, the two people upon whom Gecko was most based, Ivan Boesky and Michael Milken, did get convicted and go to jail. Not only that, but about the time the movie was made, or a little later, the first big late 20th century financial scandal broke, the savings and loan scandal. Because the savings and loans, such as the one run by George Bailey, had been locked into a lot of long-term loans and at relatively low interest. And then along came inflation and they were getting hurt. And I don't know the details, but they were allowed in the 80s to make all kinds of speculative investments that in the past that they would not have been. And most of them suddenly, many of them suddenly at the end of the 80s found themselves on the verge of bankruptcy. The government very quickly passed a bailout of, I think it was about $120 billion, which by 21st century standards is a fairly modest bailout, but in those days, that was a lot of money. But not only that, the FBI was turned loose on the situation in a big way. It made thousands of criminal referrals. And as a result of that scandal, more than 1,000 executives actually got convicted and went to jail. Now, what this reminds me of is several scenes in Getting Straight, where Elliot Gould, being rather irresponsible, if you remember, he had to deal with the woman who was administering term bills, and he had to deal with his landlady, and then he got caught by Will Hunt cheating on the exam, and none of them was going to give him any kind of a break. And in the same way, I would say that in the late 80s, grown-ups were still running the world, that GI accountability ethos was still around, and those people could not escape it. Whereas, as Tamara pointed out, when, and we will look at this in detail too in a few weeks, the entire economy was brought down by absurd speculative practices in the OOs, virtually nobody went to jail. And thus, all this, I do think, is revealing about some very significant changes in our society that have had huge consequences, having to do with what you could get away with then and what you can get away with now. Feel free to comment.
I'll tell you this, if millennials were running the world in 2009, everyone would have been thrown in jail.
Well, I think that might be true, but that's not how the world works.
Yeah, so what's the crime?
I beg your pardon?
No, I've just asked Chaz if they're all going to go to jail. Tell me what the crime is.
Well, one of the crimes that's being punished now is having the wrong views about certain things, which can have all sorts of terrible consequences for people if they express them indiscreetly. But that's another story. Any other comments on this?
Well, this goes back to this whole issue of compliance. And I was in various industrial environmental groups that contained people that worked for extremely large corporations. And of course, environmental regulations changed radically around this same time we're talking about, and contain much more accountability, much more severe regulations. Yeah. And what I became aware of, and I was in a small company, we were a bit player in this whole thing, but these people that work for big companies, compliance was everything. Like if the rules were going to change, they might object to it, but if the rules went through, their total focus was on obeying the rules. There was no sense of scofflaw or we're not going to do that. It was just the opposite. So in terms of financial regulation for banks, I can perfectly understand how that would be the total focus today, like I experienced with these big corporations that had environmental footprints, that it was all about compliance.
Okay, there's a lot of loosening of environmental regulations that's been going on in the last 3 years, though, on a lot of fronts.
Well, for obvious.
Well, you got to get into the details of that. So, too big a subject.
All right. Well, let's take a different tack and a more generational one. And let's just talk a little bit about Gordon Gekko. What stands out to you about him as a person? Judy.
He was quite aware of class differences, and he was very resentful of them.
That is true.
Yeah, the film kind of portrays him as having pulled himself up by his bootstraps, and because he came from a lower class, not without money, it's a trend I've been noticing in films more and more often, that oh, it's the noble capitalist class, the person who is born to it, who is faultless, who has all these morals and all these good values, versus the person who pulled themselves up from being dirt poor. Is all the scheming, wicked, evil kind of character. Now, I will give Wall Street this. They pit him against another character who's like him but younger. So I'll give it props for that. It doesn't put him against a person who is raised amongst the capitalist class. I'll just as a term for that. But in terms of stereotypes, it did kind of send some triggers off for me in terms of like, oh, I've seen this kind of person before, and trope. Sorry.
Tamara.
I'm thinking, Chaz, just in terms of what you just said, when you said pit him against, that the person morally he was pitted against was Martin Sheen's character, the father.
Yes.
Who, you know, as opposed to Buzz, whatever his name was. Is that what you were thinking? Were you thinking of the father, or were you thinking of?
Yeah, that was actually, I was like, oh, wow.
Oh, okay. I thought you meant the son. Okay, just kidding.
Mhm.
Erase that.
Janie.
I think Gecko had no redeeming moral qualities at all. It was like, sort of, he checked the box of womanizer, bad dad. The scene with the child, that was just that hurt. I just couldn't believe watching that. Mistreating his wife, double timing everybody, and just taking advantage of everybody and saying, you know, I'm just going to rip everyone off. So I can't think of any redeeming moral quality that Gecko had at all.
Is Gecko a significant type in the history of the last half century or so? John. Unmute, John. Unmute.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody, a friend of mine who is a stockbroker, and he was very captured by that movie at that time. He was starting out in the business. And he said, actually, that movie had the opposite intended effect. It made people more interested in that industry. And a lot of people wanted to be like Gecko because they felt, you know, the money that was available was very attractive. And it was actually, it's, you know, it's hard to conceive of it, but there was almost a romance to that kind of figure that a lot of young guys were very caught up with at that time. And, you know, things really moved into the finance area, the .com later on, and it was very much an outgrowth of the activity in that industry. It's, but I did think that there were actually some nice values in this movie, and that the relationship that Charlie Sheen had with his dad was, you know, I think it gave him a sense of values and integrity. And I felt the most important line was where Martin Sheen said, create something.
Yeah, at the
Make
end.
something, you know, something tangible, a service, a commodity that people want and are willing to pay out of their own resources voluntarily to purchase. There's nobility in that, as opposed to just shifting people's money around. And I mean, that's a service too, but it doesn't have the same kind of groundedness that actually creating something has.
Yes, Susan.
Well, to come back to your question, I think that he is maybe somewhat stereotyped, but I do think he is a character, a figure that we recognize, you know, as part of the, what did you say, past 50 years or whatever. I mean, we've just alluded to some of them who were, you know, went to prison. You know, he clearly, you know, the purpose in life for him was just to make money and make as much money, make more money. I mean, making deals, that was what kept him going. And it didn't matter how you did it. In fact, probably the more dishonestly you did it, you know, the more successful you were. So I think we've had people, you know, in real life who, you know, whose behavior, you know, definitely was reflected in, you know, in this character. Probably most recently, but very different. Madoff, you know, I mean, just a totally different character.
Yes.
But I mean, you know, he certainly represents, you know, what happens when you get carried away by the need to, you know, to make money, and this drive, you know, that's all there is to life, is just to keep making money.
How about, excuse me, how about the way he deals with people around him? I'm not talking about his family, I'm talking about in the work environment. How does he try to make things happen? James, yes.
These people are not new. I mean, we have J.P. Morgan, we got Bernard Baruch. You know, there's always that.
Joseph
that
P. Kennedy, also, yeah.
I mean,
That's
there's
true.
nothing new. There's nothing new about Gordon Gekko.
All right.
At least they had some social conscience, or at least they had to do something with that money that had some social.
Well, you know, you take somebody like Bill Gates, who was the most ruthless business person of the last 50 years, and John D. Rockefeller, kind of the same way in his time.
Yes.
They retire and they put their PR machines to work, and all of a sudden they're these great benefactors of mankind. And it's just, you know, this stuff just, it gets repeated over and over again.
But I mean,
all right, okay, I can't stand this any
All right.
longer. I'm just so flabbergasted. There is not a single one of you among 13 who had a single thought about Donald Trump while watching this movie.
Oh God, who wants to think about Donald Trump?
Exactly, Susan. Exactly.
Well, he is, after all, president.
Here.
Donald Trump is even worse than.
Yeah.
We don't want. We have to deal with thinking
He's
about
like
him.
Gecko. He's like Gecko. He's like Gecko without the brains. Okay.
That's right. That's
but
right.
The
No brain.
incredible thing is the way they have both managed to get where they are by the force of their personality. Okay.
Yeah.
But there's another generational aspect to that, which I think is really frightening and really significant. And to make my point, I'm going to do a little screen share here, if I can find what I'm looking for. Yeah. Is this should do it, I think. Okay, what I've got here is a slide which I made up based on our discussion of 12 Angry Men about virtues and vices. So, let's see what we can do here. Oh, okay. Yeah. We're all set here.
Blurry.
Okay, do you see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, where do you see Gordon Gekko there?
In the vices.
Yeah, how about that? So,
Me, but there aren't enough of them.
yes, all right, fine. Now, my point is, I honestly believe that in general, in the GI world of the high, you could not make your way through the world acting like that. It really wouldn't work. But in the boomer run world, which was shaped by that late 60s, 70s experience of all hell breaking loose on campus, and where rage, strong emotions of all kinds become the way to be, it does work. And it's working for Gekko, and it's certainly worked for Trump to an astonishing extent. And I'm afraid, to me, that says something very depressing about my own generation and the world that we managed to create. Yes, John. Unmute, John. Unmute.
Yeah, I've got it. I've got it. But how did the transition happen between the 60s when you had the Woodstock counterculture, which was love and peace and trying to create a new world? Those are the same people that wound up on the Wall Street situation. So there was really a radical turnabout, I think, of the kind of prevailing culture that there was on the campuses at that time and what those people evolved into once they became, 30-somethings.
I think, first of all, they'd persuaded themselves that the rules of their parents' generation made no sense anymore. Whether that had to do with premarital sex, certain drugs, or how you act on Wall Street. We can remake the world, and that's what we're going to do. But secondly, I really think that just the kind of basic sense about how you act, manners, things like that, language you use, those restraints went down too, just the way they went down on movie screens and television screens. And thus, I mean, I don't understand. You see, this is, okay, people don't want to talk about Trump. That's fine. The real mystery to me is why he didn't get put out of business and in jail where he belonged decades ago. And I hope somebody can manage to explain that sometime. No. Am I curious enough to try to write that book myself? Hell no, I'm not. But there is something different in the ethos of our time that has allowed lots of people to get away with all kinds of things, and we'll get into that next week too, that they couldn't in the earlier age. Okay, we've got Chaz, we've got James, and we've got Janie. Chaz, go ahead.
During the GI era, he had Daddy to protect him.
I'm sorry, who had Daddy to protect who?
Trump.
Oh, yes, that's true. Oh, he did. Yes, that's true.
So if he was going to get run up against any of the GI good boys, so to speak,
well, maybe.
Daddy was going to be there to make sure it didn't hit him too hard. And then by the time Daddy was dead, Trump was among his own cohort.
Okay, Janie? You're mute.
Yeah, okay. I think in terms of Trump, first of all, Chad, I think you were right. Those were good comments. In the New York real estate and in the international banking situation, first of all, clearly, all the rules were broken and Trump could do whatever he wanted and womanize and, horrible things that he's done. But I also think the money laundering and the fact that after the fall of the Soviet Union and the oligarchs and the incredible money floating around looking for money laundering and the Deutsche Bank stuff and all the offshore stuff, that if Trump had not been able to get into the money laundering, which he's done, which is what he's afraid of when he loses office, it'll catch up with him. But the fact that the rest of the banking world, particularly Deutsche Bank, was willing to launder the money that would save Trump after each one of his bankruptcies. And I don't know how that fits in with generations or anything else, but that tremendous amounts of money floating around.
Well, actually, in terms of how it fits in with generations, this is fascinating. And this is the one place where I have to say Trump did latch on to something that, even though he kept going bankrupt, his name was so famous that he could trade on it. And apparently that was the big reason that they didn't force him out of business altogether. And why people like Deutsche Bank were going to back him. Actually, Deutsche Bank apparently was the only bank that would lend him anything after the casinos went bust in the 90s. So that's another mystery.
Right, and it was because of their own, what sort of the European banking system, which I believe is, I've just gotten the book on Deutsche Bank. I have to read it.
Oh.
But that whole Yeah, because if that money had not been there, Trump would not be Trump today. He would not have survived.
Right.
So
Okay, James. Yes.
Yeah, if I could, one sentence to summarize boomers, it's stick it to the man. And whatever the man is, and it could be the government, it could be your father, it could be the Wall Street apparatus, it could be the Hal Holbrook generation, but stick it to the man is what you hear all these people saying in their use of language, their use of financial tools, everything. I mean, that goes on to this day.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is a boomer thing or not. I'm not prepared to say it is. But the other huge change, which is at the heart of a lot of the arguments with the Hal Holbrook character, it comes up a couple times, is the very narrow focus in the corporate world for some time now on short-term results. And Holbrook specifically says that, but that is a huge change that's had fantastic consequences. Yeah, okay, was somebody waiting?
I would agree that that's a boomer failing, in my opinion.
You think so? Very interesting. Yeah.
But
I think Gen X can take some blame for that too.
Okay, very interesting.
Yeah.
It wasn't a failing of
But
this boomer. I thought nothing about taking 5 years to write a book, but that's just me, I guess. Onward.
But
Yeah,
there's
James.
some companies like Amazon who did set aside huge amounts of monies, operated at a loss
Yeah.
for years to
That's
build a business. So, be careful with the generalities about who's doing short. The short-term people tend to be not in the growth industries so much as in the old line established industries that are trying to pump their stock price.
Okay. But again, I do think these issues about personality and how you can act and what makes you famous and so on are very important generational differences that have had huge impact. Susan.
I just want to add that I really, whoever paid any attention really to Trump until he was on reality TV. I think that's where his personality, his persona, his magnetism, whatever you want to, his charisma, really, gained a foothold in the base that he has. But when he was, I certainly wasn't paying a whole lot of attention. Nor was I when he was on reality TV. But when he was doing his wheeling and dealing and all this stuff the stuff that we're learning about Deutsche Bank is all fairly recent. So when he was going through all his business dealings and his bankruptcies, yes, it was making news, but it wasn't like, it wasn't a national figure. And I think that, that the whole reality TV era for him just put him in a whole different
Well,
world.
I see the other hands and I want to go to you, but I can't resist this. It's my favorite quote from Generations, published in 1991. And it is a survey of the moment they're writing at. And the question they're answering is, how do you see the world today depending on your generation? Okay, so if you're a GI this, if you're a silent this. If you're a boomer, it says, you may be rather surprised, I'm not sure what the word is, I should have had the book, but at your contemporaries who have made it up the ladder of success, such as Dan Quayle and Donald Trump. So that rather shockingly prophetic statement. I mean, could be made in 1990. And he got a lot of publicity in the 80s. And I remember John Kenneth Galbraith reviewing The Art of the Deal in the New York Times and a lot of stuff like that. Okay, Kevin, go ahead. Kevin. Uh-oh.
He froze.
Okay, I'm back. Kevin.
I think we lost him.
No, we lost Kevin?
Yeah.
For the moment we did. Okay, somebody else was up. Yeah, Michael and then James.
Michael and James, and then myself.
And then you. Okay, yeah, Michael.
So I want to think about this a little more than, because this is really very thought provoking, and I really want to think about this. What we've been saying for the last couple minutes.
Okay.
But I do have a question about it, and that is, when I think about the individuals who embody the kind of behavior that Gecko carried out, the raiders from the 1980s were in general people like Gecko. They were people who went to City University, as Gecko says he did.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
They weren't. It wasn't Goldman Sachs. It wasn't J.P. Morgan. It wasn't
Bain Capital.
Yeah. Well. Hold on.
Okay.
So, in terms of who the raiders were, the people who Gecko represents, the Asher Edelmans, the Steinberg Green Mailers, the T. Boone Pickens, that whole group of people were basically not central to Wall Street finance as it then was. Okay, and after they had, so where the impetus for this came from was this whole group of essentially marginal characters. Once they had shown that you can make a ton of money doing this,
yes,
then there got to be a huge number of LBO funds that were run by Bain Capital, by lots of other financial engineers who, drew on the services of, the same group of people who had been supporting Boesky and Milken and T. Boone Pickens and all those other guys. Okay, and so my sense is that this first group of raiders was the most outlandish, and that once it had gotten to be Mitt Romney and the others, they were a little more white shoe. I cannot imagine Mitt Romney, if you picked up that slide and showed the virtues and vices.
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay. So so I don't quite know how that fits. I want to think about it. I wonder if you just have any reaction to the fact that the Geckos were not the core of this, but on the margins. And again, on the marginal player can make a huge contribution, right? So I don't want to undermine that, but just
all right. We're talking about a couple of different things, both of which are very important. Now, I do think it's been incredibly important to the economy, what you said, that they set the pattern for a lot more people down the road. But in terms of this general personality in which somebody is claiming that he has all the answers, he's riding roughshod over everybody around him, he can't lose. It's interesting, by the way, I'm sorry Kevin isn't here, that Gecko is a big fan of Sun Tzu, okay? Because at the War College, we used to teach Sun Tzu and Clausewitz, who were the two great theorists. The interesting thing is Sun Tzu was more of a salesman because he keeps telling you, read my book and you can't lose, okay? Which is the kind of message that Gecko wants to hear. Clausewitz is much too smart to ever say anything like that. He had been on the losing side in a couple of big wars, and he knew that there's no guarantee. But that general way out there personality, and I know everything, nobody else knows anything, and we're going to throw out the rule book and write a whole new one, I think has been very important in a lot of walks of life. during this period, including, as we will see next week, in politics. Not so much from the movie we're watching, but something else, which I have planned. Okay, we had other hands up. James. Yes.
James and then
Then Chaz. Yes. Yes, James. Unmute. Yeah.
So to me, Trump is actually a great example of my stick it to the man. I mean, the guy's from Queens. Everybody looked down on him. He was just this real estate guy, but he had a lot of money, but he got no respect. So his attitude, is just kind of F you to everybody that doesn't serve him.
Literally at this point.
And we see that going on today, but it's still just another part of sticking it to the man that the boomers feel to their core.
Okay, Chaz.
my point was going off of when Trump re-emerged into popular mindset. In terms of when I think of cultural examples, I can think of Back to the Future 2 as the first time where he kind of enters the popular mindset as being the prototype for Biff and the alternate bad 1985 sort of thing. And the other thing I can think of is actually coming from the early 2000s, about the time when his reality TV show was just coming onto the air and was the big deal it was. And that's when Stephen Sondheim redid Bernstein's Candide, a musical from the 1950s, which kind of went into the operetta scene, but as it is. And they cast in one scene essentially a judge for an auto da fe, because in the story of Candide eventually ends up at an auto da fe after Lisbon gets hit with an earthquake, and sort of portraying Trump as like this figure in place of like a cardinal judge, kind of like, oh, what should we do with these prisoners we have? Oh, fire them, kind of thing, which was in a weird way prophetic that I did not expect.
Yeah.
So I would say definitely that while he did have an early bump in terms of entering the popular consciousness, that I would agree that it wasn't really until his reality TV show took off that he got
right. Yes. Right.
fame that he so desired.
And by the way, the reality TV show was created by Mark Burnett, who also created Survivor. And I have to admit that in 20 years, I probably haven't missed more than 3 episodes of Survivor ever. I'm hopelessly addicted to it. But it's been very depressing. And one of the things that's depressing about it for me was that if you've ever watched it, for a while, Survivor is a team game that then becomes a purely individual game. And I keep waiting for some people to understand that and to play it as a team game. And I thought the millennials might when they began to dominate, but it's been just the opposite. It's more of every person for himself than ever. And alliances are more temporary than ever. Okay,
David,
John.
from time to time, you are astonishing that you actually like that. I can't believe it.
It's a bond between me and one of my sons, among other things. But I do. I can't help it. It's true. No.
The mysteries of David Kaiser.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, as Will Hunting says, at least I'm not unoriginal. Yeah. Janie. Unmute.
Okay, all right. I
Yeah.
found the lyrics to Stick It to the Man. Because it was a musical, School of Rock, that was written in 2003. I'm sure it was written by probably Gen X. And it is not very popular with today's kids, but let me give you an idea of what the lyrics are. It says, when the world has screwed you and crushed you in its fist, when the way you've treated has got you good and pissed, There's been one solution since the world began. Don't just sit and take it, stick it to the man. Rant and rave and scream and shout, get all of your aggressions out. They try to stop you, let them know exactly where they all could go, and do it just as loudly as you can. Stick it to the man. Parents overwork, yeah, stick it to the man. Hate the way they jerk you, yeah, stick it to the man. Tired of the system, stick it to the man. Rise up and resist them, stick it to the man. Break the rules, ignore the signs, and color way outside the lines. Go off the script, do what you like. They hate it. They can take a hike. Why live your life to someone else's plan? Stick it to the man, etc., etc. It is interesting that this is a play that high school kids can put on, but it's not very popular. But anyway, it's a real aggressive song, and it's a sort of a broken down band guy who loses his job and he becomes a music teacher at an elite high school, and then they decide to do this incredible sort of boomer, break all the rules. But anyway, it's a very hard musical to watch these days, and schools and kids kind of don't like to do it.
Okay. Yeah, John. Unmute.
Yeah, I want to go back to this idea that there was a different period there in the 60s. The people were very different, and this kind of whole Edenic vision. Joni Mitchell's song "We've Got to Get Back to the Garden,"
Yes.
which was about Woodstock.
Yes, it was.
And there was this whole kind of Aquarian vision, and I'm just wondering if the fact that didn't pan out as people thought, it was kind of like a lover that turned on them. And the result of that was the rage and the anger that you saw in A Gecko, because that visionary possibility didn't actually come to fruition. So they became capitalists with a vengeance. They became
my feeling was always that we turned out to be sheep, by and large. And when Peace, Love, and Pot was in, that's what everybody wanted to do. And 10 years later, when Making Money was in, that was what everybody wanted to do. And then Having Kids was in, and etc. Obviously, there have always been some exceptions, but that was always my explanation for that. And actually, that's partly because some of the people I knew who were the most SDS activists became investment bankers.
So Jerry Rubin.
Mario Savio. I mean, they all became bureaucrats of one sort or another.
I didn't think Savio ever really became anything. Did he?
Maybe I'm thinking of Jerry Rubin. I think he did.
Okay.
Let's say that as a young stoner in the 1980s, there were definitely boomer hippies around still.
Okay. Yeah.
Not all the hippies turned to yuppies.
No. Oh, that's true. No, some of them have remained that way.
Yeah.
For a long time.
Living up in rural environments.
Oh yeah. No.
Gatherings in the 1980s, and
I know.
No. My wife was one of them, and she and her then husband homesteaded on a ranch in Arizona for a while.
I know a few boomer hippies who went into the dog show world and are still children.
All right, James, we're winding down now.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, I thought one of the greatest ads of all time was probably about 20 years ago. I think it was Verizon or one of the cell phone companies, and this woman comes in to talk to her boss with the, in the high-rise building, and he's so proud that he's gotten $20 off his cell phone bill, and he looks at the young person and he says, "It's just my way of sticking it to the man." And the response was, "But sir, you are the man." And I feel like that, that's kind of what if I could somehow ever get through Trump's impenetrable wall of conceit and whatever, it would be to tell him, you can lay off this now. You are the man. You don't need to stick it to the man anymore. But anyway, that's
all right. Yeah. Well, I do think the earliest part of the discussion about changing values in this industry and other industries was very interesting, and about what millennials seem to want out of life. And well, I won't go into the whole history of this. Some of you know it, but it does confirmed something that I've been suggesting for quite a while in other forums, namely that the new high, could be just around the corner. That that this is a way, apparently, in which we seem to be ready for it. In that is the kind of world that a lot of our young people would like to enter, if we can give them a chance. But we'll just put that aside now. And okay, this week we have looked at the impact of boomers taking some leadership positions in the financial world. Next week, we will look at the parallel story of boomers moving in leadership positions in the political world. And again, another wonderful movie, Primary Colors, that always amazes me every time I watch it. Yes, Janie.
David, Bill and Neil always thought that one generation created the culture for the next generation down. And so that what you see as culture that we consume is actually created by slightly older playwrights, singers, what have you. I mean,
Yeah, music is always like that.
Yeah, music is, except that boomers can't seem to get off the stage. We're still there. It's like, couldn't we leave? But I guess that's one of the questions I have with the movies, because I don't know as much about the movies, whether or not, as what we are watching, does that hold?
I think the question, well, okay, I'll let you have a chance to ask, but the question about the movies right now is whether they're going to survive at all in the way in which we've known them, I think.
Yeah.
Chaz, go ahead. What are you going to say?
The boomer sensibility, which I kind of relate to late to 1980s through 2000s kind of romanticism in terms of filmmaking, a very romanticized style of putting a film together. That's what I just kind of label it in my head as. Kind of died out in the 2000s to be replaced with Gen X or directors who are still in control at the current moment. Though there are attempts for millennials to break in, it isn't really so much so the case at the moment that they have completely done so. So since at least the early to mid 2000s, Gen X has been in control of the film industry, maybe not the financial parts of it, but like in terms of directorship and creative control and output, they've been the ones in control.
Yeah, thank you, Chad, because that was what I just don't know enough about film, but that would be that I would assume that that's the case, that Gen X actually controls the film industry right now in terms of writing.
Yeah, especially around 2003 was a big year where Gen X kind of took over, where they went from being like prestigious indie filmmakers to mainstream filmmakers.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you, David. See you next week.
Thank you, David.
David, see you next week. Bye-bye.
See you then.